A wealthy widow buried her fifth husband on a cold Tuesday morning in November, accepting condolences with tears that seemed too perfect. But halfway through the funeral service, the church doors burst open, and what everyone saw next would expose a horrifying secret that had been 20 years in the making. Victoria Blackwood stood at the front of St. Andrew's Chapel, draped in black silk, her face a masterpiece of calculated grief. The townspeople of Willowbrook had gathered to pay their respects to Robert Blackwood, the 62-year-old real estate mogul who had supposedly died of a sudden heart attack just 3 days earlier. But as Victoria dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, accepting the sympathetic embraces of friends and neighbors, none of them could have imagined the web of deception that was about to unravel before their very eyes. For 20 years, Victoria had perfected the art of becoming the perfect grieving widow. She knew exactly when to let her voice break, when to lean on others for support, and when to display just the right amount of vulnerability to garner sympathy. The funeral was proceeding exactly as she had planned, just like the 4 others before it. But this time, someone had been watching, someone had been planning, and someone was about to turn her carefully constructed world upside down. The morning of November 15th dawned grey and bitter in Willowbrook, Pennsylvania, a town where secrets traveled faster than gossip and everyone knew their neighbor's business. Victoria Blackwood had lived in this close-knit community for exactly 2 years and 4 months, having moved there shortly after marrying Robert, her 5th husband. To the outside world, she was the epitome of tragic romance, a woman cursed to lose every man she had ever loved. Victoria was 48 years old, though she claimed to be 42, with auburn hair that caught the light just so and green eyes that could convey heartbreak or desire with equal intensity. She had a way of making men feel like they were her saviors, the one person who could heal her broken heart and give her the love she had been denied by cruel fate. Her beauty was the kind that aged gracefully, enhanced by expensive skincare treatments and subtle cosmetic procedures that she never admitted to having. Robert Blackwood had been her latest conquest, though she would never have used such a crude term. To her, these were love affairs, each one genuine in its own way, each man representing a chance at happiness that was inevitably snatched away by death. Robert owned Blackwood Properties, the most successful real estate firm in 3 counties, and his portfolio included everything from luxury residential developments to commercial shopping centers. His net worth exceeded $12 million, a fact that Victoria had researched thoroughly before their first date. Their courtship had followed her usual pattern. They met at a charity fundraiser for the local animal shelter, where Victoria volunteered twice a week, always making sure to wear clothing that showed off her figure while still appearing modest and caring. Robert was immediately smitten by this beautiful woman, who seemed so devoted to helping others, so wounded by her past losses, and so genuinely interested in his stories about building his business from nothing. Within 6 months, they were engaged. Within a year, they were married in a small ceremony that Victoria insisted should be intimate, claiming she could not bear the thought of a large celebration when her heart still ached for her previous husbands. Robert found her sensitivity touching, and her reluctance to discuss her past understandable. After all, what kind of monster would press a woman to relive such painful memories? The people of Willowbrook had welcomed Victoria with open arms, particularly the women who admired her strength in the face of such repeated tragedy. She had shared carefully edited versions of her previous marriages during coffee dates and book club meetings, always emphasizing how deeply she had loved each man and how devastated she had been by their deaths. Her first husband, she claimed, had died in a car accident just 2 years into their marriage. Her second had succumbed to cancer after a brave but ultimately futile battle. Her third husband had died of complications from diabetes, and her fourth had suffered a fatal stroke while they were on their honeymoon in Hawaii. Each death had left her more broken, she explained, but also more determined to live life to the fullest in honor of their memory. She established small memorial gardens at each of the homes she had shared with her husbands, always taking photographs to show new friends and potential suitors. The gardens were beautiful, carefully maintained, and deeply moving to anyone who saw them. They were also completely fabricated, created in the backyards of rental properties that she photographed and then abandoned. Detective Rachel Morrison had been keeping an eye on Victoria Blackwood since she arrived in Willowbrook, though she had no official reason to do so. Rachel was a 34-year-old investigator with the Pennsylvania State Police, assigned to the regional office that covered Willowbrook and the surrounding communities. She had a reputation for being thorough, intuitive, and unwilling to accept coincidence as an explanation for anything unusual. Rachel first became aware of Victoria through a casual conversation with her cousin, who lived in Millfield, Ohio, and worked as a records clerk for the county courthouse. During a family barbecue the previous summer, her cousin had mentioned a woman who had been married 4 times and widowed 4 times, all before the age of 46. The woman had recently moved away after her latest husband died, leaving behind a substantial life insurance payout and a house that she sold within weeks of the funeral. The description matched Victoria Blackwood perfectly, and Rachel began doing some unofficial research in her spare time. What she found was a pattern that stretched across 4 states and 20 years. A trail of dead husbands and wealthy widows that always seemed to lead back to the same woman, though she had used different variations of her name in each location. Victoria Blackwell, Victoria Blackstone, Victoria Blackwater, and now Victoria Blackwood. Each marriage had lasted between 18 months and 3 years. Each husband had been a successful businessman or professional, typically recently divorced or never married, always lonely and looking for companionship. Each death had been sudden, but not immediately suspicious, the kind of medical emergency or accident that could happen to anyone. And each time, Victoria had inherited substantial assets, collected significant life insurance payouts, and moved to a new state within 6 months of the funeral. Rachel had tried to interest her superiors in opening an investigation, but without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, there was nothing they could do. Coincidence was not a crime, and being unlucky in love, even repeatedly, was not grounds for criminal charges. But Rachel could not shake the feeling that Victoria Blackwood was a predator, a woman who hunted wealthy men with the patience and skill of a professional con artist. So Rachel watched and waited, hoping that Victoria would make a mistake, or that some piece of evidence would surface to justify a formal investigation. She documented Victoria's daily routines, her financial transactions, and her social interactions, building a file that she knew would be crucial if the opportunity for justice ever arose. Robert Blackwood had been different from Victoria's previous targets in one important way. He was not lonely or desperate for companionship. He was a confident, successful man who had been married once before, divorced amicably, and maintained a good relationship with his ex-wife and their 2 adult children. He was also, unknown to Victoria, a careful and suspicious person when it came to his personal safety and financial security. Robert had built his fortune through careful planning, attention to detail, and an ability to spot potential problems before they became serious issues. These same skills that made him successful in business also made him cautious in his personal relationships. When he began dating Victoria, he was charmed by her beauty and apparent vulnerability, but he was also curious about her past. Unlike Victoria's previous husbands, Robert hired a private investigator to conduct a background check on the woman he was considering marrying. The investigation revealed enough inconsistencies and unanswered questions to make Robert suspicious, but not enough concrete evidence to confront Victoria directly. Instead, he decided to proceed with the relationship while taking steps to protect himself and gather more information. The morning of Robert's funeral, Victoria woke in the master bedroom of their expansive colonial home on Elm Street, the same bedroom where she claimed to have found Robert's lifeless body 3 days earlier. She went through her morning routine with practiced precision, selecting her outfit, applying her makeup, and rehearsing her performance in the full-length mirror. The black dress was designer but not flashy, expensive enough to show that she had been well provided for, but modest enough to demonstrate appropriate grief. Her jewelry was limited to her wedding ring, a simple gold cross necklace, and small pearl earrings that had supposedly belonged to her grandmother. Her hair was styled in a simple chignon, and her makeup was carefully applied to suggest that she was trying to look presentable despite her overwhelming sorrow. Victoria had learned through experience that the key to a successful performance was subtlety. Too much emotion would seem theatrical and false. Too little would appear cold and suspicious. The perfect grieving widow was devastated, but trying to be strong, heartbroken but grateful for the time she had been given, overwhelmed by loss but determined to honor her husband's memory. As she prepared for the day ahead, Victoria mentally reviewed the details of her plan. After the funeral, she would maintain a low profile for approximately 6 months, allowing the immediate grief to fade, and the estate to be settled. She had already identified her next destination, a small city in North Carolina, where she had located several potential targets through online dating sites and social media research. The life insurance payout would be substantial, nearly $2 million, plus another $1 million in assets from Robert's estate. Combined with the funds she had accumulated from her previous marriages, Victoria would be financially secure for the rest of her life. She could retire from her deadly career and live comfortably, perhaps even find genuine companionship with someone who had modest means and no significant assets to tempt her darker impulses. But first, she had to get through this funeral without arousing suspicion. She had to play the role of the grieving widow one final time, accept the condolences of the community, and allow herself to be comforted by friends and neighbors who genuinely cared about her welfare. The funeral home had done an excellent job with the arrangements exactly as Victoria had requested. The casket was elegant, but not ostentatious. The flowers were beautiful but not excessive, and the program included a photograph of Robert that captured his warm smile and kind eyes. Victoria had selected the photograph carefully, choosing one that would evoke maximum sympathy while reinforcing the image of a loving marriage, cut short by tragic circumstances. As she drove to the chapel, Victoria noticed Detective Morrison's unmarked police car parked across the street from the funeral home. The detective had been a persistent annoyance for the past several months, always seeming to appear at local events and gatherings where Victoria was present, always watching with those sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see too much. Victoria was not particularly concerned about Detective Morrison's attention. After all, the detective had no evidence of wrongdoing, and Victoria had been careful to ensure that Robert's death appeared completely natural. The heart attack had been induced through a combination of drugs that would be virtually undetectable in a standard autopsy, particularly given Robert's age and the stress he had been under due to several challenging business deals. Victoria had perfected this method through years of research and practice. She understood exactly which substances to use, how to administer them without detection, and how to create the perfect conditions for a fatal cardiac event. She also knew how to appear shocked and devastated when she discovered the body, how to call for help in a way that demonstrated appropriate panic, and how to answer questions from paramedics and police officers without arousing suspicion. The chapel was nearly full when Victoria arrived, a testament to Robert's standing in the community and the genuine affection that people felt for him. She was greeted at the door by Pastor Williams, who had officiated at her wedding to Robert just 2 years earlier. The pastor's eyes were filled with compassion as he took her hands in his and offered words of comfort and support. Victoria allowed herself to be escorted to the front pew, where she sat, surrounded by Robert's family and closest friends. His ex-wife, Margaret, sat beside her, having traveled from Philadelphia to pay her respects to the man she had been married to for 15 years. Their children, David and Susan, both in their 20s, flanked their mother, their faces reflecting genuine grief for the father they had loved and respected. As the service began, Victoria played her part perfectly. She listened attentively as Pastor Williams spoke about Robert's life and legacy, his contributions to the community, and his devotion to his family. She dabbed her eyes at appropriate moments, accepted comfort from those around her, and maintained the composed but fragile demeanor that had served her so well in the past. But Detective Morrison was watching from the back of the chapel, and she noticed things that others missed. She saw how Victoria's tears seemed to come and go on command, how her body language changed when she thought no one was looking, and how she occasionally glanced toward the exit as if calculating her escape route. Rachel had spent the morning making phone calls to her contacts in other states, following up on leads that had emerged from her unofficial investigation. She had spoken with detectives in Ohio, Tennessee, and Florida, sharing information about Victoria's pattern of behavior and asking them to review the cases of her previous husband's deaths. The responses had been encouraging. In each location, there had been detectives or medical examiners who had harbored suspicions about the deaths but lacked sufficient evidence to pursue formal investigations. Now, with the pattern established across multiple jurisdictions, there was growing interest in taking a closer look at Victoria Blackwood and her history of tragic marriages. But Rachel knew that building a case would take time, and she was concerned that Victoria would disappear before they could gather enough evidence to charge her with any crimes. She had to find a way to keep Victoria in Willowbrook long enough for the investigation to proceed. and she was running out of options. As the funeral service continued, Rachel noticed something else that struck her as odd. Several of the mourners seemed to be watching Victoria with expressions that suggested curiosity rather than sympathy. There were whispered conversations and meaningful glances, the kind of subtle communication that suggested people were beginning to have doubts about the grieving widow. Rachel recognized some of these people as long-time residents of Willowbrook, the kind of observant individuals who noticed changes in their community and were quick to spot anything that seemed out of place. If they were beginning to question Victoria's authenticity, it meant that her performance was not as convincing as she believed it to be. The realization gave Rachel hope that the truth might emerge sooner than she had expected. In small communities like Willowbrook, suspicion had a way of growing and spreading, particularly when it involved someone who was seen as an outsider. If enough people began to question Victoria's version of events, it might create the pressure needed to force a more thorough investigation into Robert's death. As Pastor Williams delivered his eulogy, describing Robert as a man of integrity, generosity, and unwavering commitment to his family and community, Victoria maintained her mask of grief, while her mind wandered to practical concerns. She had already begun liquidating some of Robert's smaller assets, transferring funds to accounts that only she could access, and preparing for her eventual departure from Willowbrook. The house would need to be sold, but she would wait several months to avoid appearing eager to dispose of her late husband's property. She had already contacted a real estate agent, ostensibly to get advice about maintaining the property's value, but actually to begin the process of preparing it for sale. The agent had suggested some minor improvements and repairs that would maximize the selling price, and Victoria had agreed to consider them while privately calculating how quickly she could complete the sale and leave town. She had also been in touch with Robert's attorney, ostensibly to understand the probate process and her responsibilities as the executor of his estate. The attorney had been sympathetic and helpful, walking her through the legal requirements and assuring her that everything was in order. Robert had been meticulous about his financial planning, and his will was clear and comprehensive, leaving the majority of his assets to Victoria, while providing generous bequests to his children and several local charities. What Victoria did not know was that Robert had been equally meticulous about protecting himself. In the months leading up to his supposed death, he had been working with his attorney, his private investigator, and Detective Morrison to build a case against his wife. He had documented her suspicious behavior, recorded conversations that revealed her true nature, and gathered evidence that would eventually expose her crimes. Robert had also taken steps to protect his assets and ensure that Victoria could not access the bulk of his wealth, even if she succeeded in killing him. The will that Victoria had seen was a decoy, designed to make her believe that she would inherit everything while actually placing most of his assets in a trust that would be dissolved and redistributed if certain conditions were met. Those conditions included evidence of criminal activity on Victoria's part, proof that Robert's death was not natural, or testimony from credible witnesses about Victoria's previous marriages and suspicious behavior. Robert had been confident that at least one of these conditions would be met, and he had arranged for the truth to be revealed in a way that would ensure justice was served. As the service continued, Margaret Blackwood, Robert's ex-wife, found herself studying Victoria with growing unease. Margaret had initially felt sorry for the younger woman, understanding the pain of losing someone you loved and wanting to offer support during such a difficult time. But as she observed Victoria's behavior throughout the service, she began to notice inconsistencies that troubled her. Victoria's grief seemed performative, too controlled and calculated for someone who had supposedly lost the love of her life just 3 days earlier. Her tears appeared and disappeared at convenient moments, and her body language suggested that she was more concerned with managing impressions than processing genuine emotion. Margaret had experienced real grief when her father died the previous year, and she recognized the difference between authentic sorrow and theatrical display. Margaret also remembered conversations she had had with Robert in the months before his death. Phone calls where he had expressed concerns about Victoria's behavior, and mentioned that he was beginning to question some of the things she had told him about her past. Robert had been a trusting person by nature, but he was also intelligent and observant, and he had started to notice contradictions in Victoria's accounts of her previous marriages. During one particular conversation, Robert had mentioned that he had tried to verify some details about Victoria's late husbands and had been unable to find death certificates or obituaries that matched her descriptions. He had hired a private investigator to look into the matter, though he had not yet shared the results of that investigation with Margaret. Now, sitting in the chapel and watching Victoria's performance, Margaret wondered if Robert had discovered something that had put him in danger. The thought was almost too terrible to contemplate, but she could not shake the feeling that there was more to Robert's sudden death than a simple heart attack. David and Susan Blackwood were having similar thoughts as they observed their stepmother throughout the service. Both of them had liked Victoria when their father first introduced her, appreciating the way she seemed to make him happy and grateful that he had found companionship after his divorce. But over time, they had begun to notice things that made them uncomfortable. Victoria had been subtly possessive of their father, finding reasons to limit his time with his children and discouraging him from maintaining close relationships with his longtime friends. She had also shown an unusual interest in his financial affairs, asking questions about his business and investments that seemed inappropriate for someone who claimed to have no head for money. Most troubling of all, Victoria had begun pushing their father to make changes to his will and insurance policies, suggesting that it was important for spouses to be each other's primary beneficiaries. She had framed these conversations as expressions of love and commitment, but David and Susan had found them manipulative and concerning. Both siblings had tried to discuss their concerns with their father, but Robert had been defensive about Victoria, interpreting their questions as jealousy or an inability to accept his new marriage. He had assured them that Victoria was a good woman who had been through tremendous pain and deserved their understanding and support. Now, watching Victoria accept condolences from the community while displaying just the right amount of vulnerability and strength, David and Susan wondered if they should have been more persistent in voicing their concerns. They also wondered if there was anything they could do now to honor their father's memory, by ensuring that the truth about his death was fully investigated. Detective Morrison continued to observe the proceedings from the back of the chapel, taking mental notes about Victoria's behavior and the reactions of other mourners. She had positioned herself where she could see most of the congregation, and she was struck by how many people seemed to be watching Victoria with expressions of doubt or suspicion. Rachel recognized several local business owners who had known Robert for years, longtime residents who prided themselves on being good judges of character, and family friends who had been part of Robert's life since long before Victoria arrived in Willowbrook. The fact that so many of these people seemed uncomfortable with Victoria's performance suggested that the community's initial sympathy was beginning to give way to skepticism. Rachel had also noticed that Victoria seemed to be avoiding eye contact with certain individuals, particularly those who might have known her previous husbands or had connections to the communities where she had lived before. This pattern of avoidance suggested that Victoria was aware of potential threats to her carefully constructed identity and was taking steps to minimize the risk of exposure. As the service neared its conclusion, Rachel prepared to implement a plan that she had been developing for several weeks. She had coordinated with detectives in multiple states to conduct simultaneous interviews with witnesses and review evidence related to Victoria's previous marriages. She had also arranged for medical examiners to take a second look at the autopsy results from Robert's death, searching for signs of foul play that might have been missed during the initial examination. Most importantly, Rachel had been working with Robert's private investigator and attorney to understand the evidence that Robert had been gathering before his death. What she had learned was both shocking and encouraging, providing a foundation for criminal charges that could finally bring Victoria to justice. But Rachel knew that timing was crucial. She needed to move quickly enough to prevent Victoria from disappearing, but carefully enough to ensure that any evidence she gathered would be admissible in court. She also needed to coordinate with prosecutors to ensure that charges could be filed in the appropriate jurisdiction, and that the case would be handled by attorneys with experience in complex multi-state investigations. As Pastor Williams invited the congregation to join in a final prayer for Robert's soul, Rachel reflected on the strange turn that her career had taken. She had never expected to be investigating a serial killer in a small Pennsylvania town, and she certainly had never imagined that the killer would be a woman who used marriage and apparent devotion as weapons to destroy the men who trusted her. But Rachel was determined to see justice served, both for Robert Blackwood and for the other men who had died at Victoria's hands. She owed it to their families, to the community of Willowbrook, and to future potential victims who deserved to be protected from this dangerous predator. Pastor Williams had just begun the closing prayer when the heavy wooden doors at the back of St. Andrew's Chapel burst open with a sound that echoed through the sanctuary like thunder. Every head turned toward the entrance, and the collective gasp that rose from the congregation was audible even over the pastor's voice, which trailed off into stunned silence. Standing in the doorway, very much alive and wearing a dark navy suit, was Robert Blackwood. Victoria's face went through a transformation that would have been comical if the circumstances had been less serious. Her carefully maintained expression of grief dissolved into shock, then confusion, then something approaching terror, as she realized that her perfectly executed plan had somehow gone catastrophically wrong. Robert walked slowly down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence that had fallen over the chapel. His face was grim, but determined, and in his hand he carried a thick manila folder that Detective Morrison recognized as the file of evidence he had been building against his wife. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert said, his voice carrying clearly throughout the chapel, "I apologize for the dramatic interruption, but I felt it was important to attend my own funeral, particularly since I have some things to say about the woman who tried to kill me." Victoria stood abruptly, her face now pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "Robert," she stammered, "what are you talking about? You died. You had a heart attack. I found you in our bedroom. I called 911. You called 911. Robert agreed, "but only after you injected me with a combination of drugs designed to simulate cardiac arrest. What you did not know is that I had been expecting something like this for months, and I had taken precautions to protect myself." Detective Morrison moved quickly to the front of the chapel, positioning herself where she could intervene if Victoria attempted to flee or become violent. She had been part of Robert's plan from the beginning, helping him to stage his own death and gather the evidence needed to expose Victoria's crimes. Robert opened the manila folder and began to speak, addressing the shocked congregation as if he were delivering a lecture rather than exposing his wife as a murderer. "For the past 6 months, I have been investigating the woman I married, the woman who calls herself Victoria Blackwood. What I discovered is that she is a serial killer who has been murdering wealthy men for 20 years. He pulled out a series of photographs and documents, holding them up for the congregation to see. Her real name is Victoria Ann Blackwell, and she has been married 7 times, not 4 as she claimed. 5 of her previous husbands are dead, killed by various methods designed to appear natural. The 6th survived her murder attempt and is currently living under an assumed identity in witness protection." Victoria was now backing toward the side exit of the chapel, her eyes darting between Robert, Detective Morrison, and the doors that represented her only chance of escape. But Robert had anticipated this possibility as well, and uniformed police officers were stationed at every exit, ready to prevent her from leaving. "The drugs that Victoria used on me 3 nights ago were designed to cause cardiac arrest," Robert continued, "but I had been working with my doctor to build up a tolerance to those specific substances. I also had medical equipment hidden in our bedroom that allowed paramedics to revive me after Victoria left the house to establish her alibi." The congregation was listening in stunned silence, trying to process the revelation that they were witnessing the exposure of a serial killer who had been living among them for more than 2 years. Some people were taking out their phones to record the proceedings, while others sat frozen in shock, unable to believe what they were hearing. Margaret Blackwood was crying, but her tears were now tears of relief rather than grief. She had known that something was wrong, and she was grateful that her instincts had been correct. David and Susan were holding each other, overwhelmed by the realization that their father was alive and that their suspicions about Victoria had been justified. "The private investigator that I hired was able to trace Victoria's movements across 4 states," Robert continued, documenting a pattern of behavior that spans 2 decades. "She would target wealthy, lonely men, typically those who were recently divorced or widowed. She would seduce them, marry them quickly, and then kill them within 2 years, always making the deaths appear natural." He pulled out a chart that showed the timeline of Victoria's marriages and the deaths of her husbands, along with the substantial financial gains she had realized from each murder. The total amount that she has stolen from her victims exceeds $8 million. She has used this money to finance her lifestyle and to research potential new targets in different communities. Victoria had stopped trying to reach the exit and was now standing in the center of the chapel, surrounded by the people she had been deceiving for more than 2 years. Her mask of grief had been completely abandoned, replaced by an expression of cold calculation as she evaluated her options and realized that she had none. "I know what you are all thinking," Victoria said, her voice now devoid of the gentle, vulnerable tone that had characterized her public persona. You are wondering how I could do such things, how I could kill people who loved me, how I could live with myself after destroying so many lives. She looked around the chapel, making eye contact with several of the people who had befriended her, who had welcomed her into their community, who had genuinely cared about her welfare. The truth is that it was easy, she continued, because none of you ever really mattered to me. You were all just props in my performance, background characters in my story. Detective Morrison stepped forward, pulling handcuffs from her belt. Victoria Ann Blackwell, she said, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Robert Blackwood, and for conspiracy to commit fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As the handcuffs clicked around Victoria's wrists, she turned to face Robert, one final time. You think you have won, she said, but this is not over. I have friends, I have resources, and I have been planning for contingencies like this for years. You may have survived this time, but you will spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, wondering when I will come for you again. Robert shook his head sadly. Victoria, it is over. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and law enforcement agencies in multiple states are now working together to build cases for the murders of your previous husbands. You will never be free to hurt anyone else again. As Detective Morrison led Victoria toward the exit, she turned back to the congregation one final time. I want all of you to remember this moment, she said, her voice carrying a note of genuine sadness, despite the evil she had done. I want you to remember that evil can wear a beautiful face, that monsters can appear to be victims, and that the people you trust the most are sometimes the ones who will destroy you. The chapel doors closed behind Detective Morrison and her prisoner, leaving the congregation in stunned silence. Pastor Williams stood at the podium, clearly struggling to find words that could address what had just occurred. Finally, he spoke, his voice shaking with emotion. Let us pray, he said, for the souls of Victoria's victims, for the families who have been torn apart by her crimes, and for our community as we try to heal from this revelation. Let us also give thanks that Robert has been spared, and that justice will finally be served. In the weeks that followed, Robert's dramatic return from the dead, the true scope of Victoria's crimes began to emerge as law enforcement agencies across multiple states coordinated their investigations. The evidence that Robert and Detective Morrison had gathered proved to be just the beginning of a much larger case that would eventually span 5 states and involve the deaths of 7 men. Victoria's first victim had been her college boyfriend, a young man from a wealthy family who had died in what appeared to be a hiking accident during their senior year. At the time, Victoria had been seen as a tragic figure, a young woman who had lost her first love in a senseless accident. The insurance payout had been modest, but it had provided Victoria with the seed money she needed to begin her career as a serial killer. Over the next 20 years, Victoria had refined her methods and expanded her targets, always staying one step ahead of law enforcement by moving frequently and changing her identity slightly with each new marriage. She had studied forensic science, pharmacology, and psychology, using her knowledge to commit nearly perfect crimes that left little evidence and aroused minimal suspicion. The turning point had come when she targeted Robert Blackwood, a man who was more cautious and suspicious than her previous victims. Robert's decision to hire a private investigator and work with law enforcement had broken the pattern that Victoria had relied on for so long, exposing her crimes and providing the evidence needed to bring her to justice. Detective Morrison became the lead investigator on what would become known as the Black Widow case, coordinating with prosecutors and investigators across multiple jurisdictions to build comprehensive cases against Victoria for each of her crimes. The investigation revealed that Victoria had used at least 12 different identities over the years, had maintained bank accounts in multiple countries, and had been planning to retire to a small island nation that had no extradition treaty with the United States. Victoria's trial became a media sensation, drawing attention from across the country as prosecutors laid out the evidence of her crimes in painstaking detail. She was ultimately convicted on multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy, receiving 7 life sentences without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, Robert testified about the psychological impact of Victoria's betrayal, describing how it had shaken his faith in his ability to judge character and trust other people. He also spoke about the courage required to fake his own death and the fear he had experienced while waiting for Victoria to make her move. I knew that I was taking an enormous risk. Robert said. But I also knew that if I did nothing, Victoria would kill me and then move on to her next victim. I could not live with the knowledge that I had allowed her to continue destroying lives when I had the power to stop her. Margaret Blackwood, Robert's ex-wife, also testified, speaking about the suspicions she had harbored about Victoria and her regret that she had not been more vocal about her concerns. I knew that something was wrong, she said, but I did not want to seem jealous or vindictive. I wish I had trusted my instincts and spoken up sooner. David and Susan Blackwood described the impact of Victoria's deception on their family, explaining how her presence had strained their relationship with their father and created an atmosphere of tension and mistrust. They also spoke about their relief at learning that their father was alive and their gratitude to Detective Morrison for her persistence in investigating Victoria's crimes. The families of Victoria's other victims also provided testimony, describing the devastation that her crimes had caused and the years of pain and confusion they had endured. Many of them had harbored suspicions about the circumstances of their loved ones' deaths, but had been unable to prove their concerns or find anyone willing to take their suspicions seriously. Victoria showed no remorse during the trial, maintaining her innocence despite overwhelming evidence and attempting to portray herself as a victim of circumstance and prejudice. She claimed that her husbands had all died of natural causes, and that she was being persecuted because people could not accept that some women were simply unlucky in love. Her defense attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that the prosecution could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Victoria had committed murder. But the jury was not convinced by these arguments, particularly given the overwhelming pattern of behavior and the detailed evidence that had been gathered by multiple law enforcement agencies. After Victoria's conviction, Detective Morrison was promoted to sergeant and assigned to lead a new task force focused on investigating serial crimes that cross state boundaries. She has become a national expert on female serial killers and frequently speaks at law enforcement conferences about the importance of recognizing patterns of behavior that might otherwise be dismissed as coincidence. Robert Blackwood has returned to his work in real estate, though he has scaled back his business activities and now focuses primarily on charitable work and spending time with his family. He has established a foundation that provides support to the families of murder victims and funds research into improved methods for detecting and investigating serial crimes. The community of Willowbrook has slowly healed from the revelation that a serial killer had been living among them for more than 2 years. The experience has made residents more cautious about newcomers and more willing to report suspicious behavior to law enforcement, but it has also strengthened the bonds between neighbors and increased appreciation for the importance of looking out for one another. St. Andrew's Chapel, where Victoria's crimes were finally exposed, has become a symbol of justice and community solidarity. Pastor Williams has used the experience as a teaching moment about the importance of trusting one's instincts and speaking up when something seems wrong, even if doing so feels uncomfortable or risky. The house where Robert and Victoria lived has been sold, with the proceeds donated to charity. The new owners have completely renovated the property, removing any trace of Victoria's presence and creating a warm, welcoming home for their young family. Detective Morrison continues to receive tips and leads about other cases that might be connected to Victoria's crimes, and she is working with the FBI to determine whether Victoria might have been responsible for additional murders that have not yet been identified. The investigation is ongoing, and it is possible that the full scope of Victoria's crimes may never be known. The case of Victoria Blackwell serves as a stark reminder that evil can often disguise itself as vulnerability, that predators can appear to be victims, and that the most dangerous people are sometimes those who seem the most harmless. It also demonstrates the importance of trusting our instincts when something feels wrong, even if we cannot immediately explain why. Robert Blackwood's courage in risking his own life to expose Victoria's crimes prevented her from claiming additional victims and brought justice to the families of the men she had murdered. His decision to work with law enforcement rather than confronting Victoria directly saved his life and ensured that the evidence against her would be preserved and admissible in court. Detective Morrison's persistence in investigating Victoria, despite the lack of official support, shows how important it is for law enforcement officers to follow their instincts and pursue cases that others might dismiss. Her willingness to spend her own time and resources building a case against Victoria ultimately saved lives and brought a dangerous criminal to justice. The community of Willowbrook learned that safety and security require vigilance and that protecting each other means being willing to ask difficult questions and report suspicious behavior. The experience has made them stronger and more united, demonstrating that even the most traumatic events can sometimes bring out the best in people. For all of us, this case offers important lessons about the nature of trust and the importance of being aware of the people we allow into our lives. It reminds us that background checks and verification are not signs of paranoia, but reasonable precautions in a world where not everyone has good intentions. Most importantly, Victoria's crimes and eventual capture demonstrate that justice, though sometimes delayed, can prevail when good people work together to expose the truth and protect the innocent. The courage of individuals like Robert Blackwood and Detective Morrison shows that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they are willing to take risks for the greater good. If this case has taught us anything, it is that we must never stop questioning, never stop investigating, and never stop fighting for justice, even when the odds seem overwhelming and the truth seems impossible to uncover. Have you ever encountered someone who seemed too good to be true, or noticed patterns of behavior that made you uncomfortable even though you could not explain why? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and do not forget to subscribe to True Crime Village for more incredible stories of justice, survival, and the triumph of good over evil. Your subscription helps us continue bringing you these important stories that remind us all to stay vigilant and protect one another in our communities.